Opening debate. The Honourable Member for Mount Royal.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today on behalf of the great constituency of Mount Royal in response to the Trône speech. And I want to address the speech not only in terms of what it says, but the importance of what it does not say, thereby undercutting its own stated priorities. I will address the missing priorities and the diminishing thereby of the stated priorities on both the international and domestic level. First, the Trône speech makes eloquent mention of our shared values: democracy, freedom, human rights, the rule of law, and the need for international leadership to protect these values. And we agree with that. Yet it ignores the most compelling international concerns today and the corresponding assaults on these very fundamental values. I'm referring, for example, to the genocide by attrition in Darfur, where 400,000 have already died, where 4 million are in desperate need of humanitarian assistance, where the violence, including the indiscriminate bombing and burning of villages, sexual violence, assaults on humanitarian aid workers, continues unabated. And both the Darfur peace process and the comprehensive peace process are in danger of unraveling, threatening not only the stability of Sudan, but 9 neighboring countries. Mr. Speaker, I'm not saying that the government is unaware of the Darfur tragedy, or that the government has done nothing, but it has not identified it as a priority. The best evidence for that is that the word Darfur, even the word Africa, is not even mentioned in the Trône speech, let alone addressed in terms of, and I quote, the commitment, focus, and action of which the Trône speech otherwise speaks. Monsieur le Président, ce n'est pas un problème partisan. À simplement parler, alors que la communauté internationale saisit, les Darfouriens continuent de mourir. J'espérerais que le gouvernement fasse preuve de leadership international, moral, politique et diplomatique nécessaire ce que soit prise l'action concrète qui est requise. Nor is there any mention in the Trône speech of the state-sanctioned incitement to genocide whose epicenter is Ahmadinejad's Iran. I say Ahmadinejad's Iran because I'm not referring to the Iranian people nor to the many publics in Iran who are themselves the object of massive domestic repression of human rights. Monsieur le Président, cette omission flagrante est particulièrement déconcertante. Comme il a été mentionné lors de la conférence mondiale sur la prévention du génocide qui s'est tenue la semaine dernière à l'Université McGill, les leçons durables à tirer de l'Holocauste et des génocides ayant eu lieu au Balkan et au Rwanda est que ces génocides ont été perpétrés non seulement à cause d'une machinerie de la mort, mais aussi à cause d'une idéologie de haine promue par l'État. It was this teaching of contempt, this demonizing of the other, this is where it all begins. As our own courts have affirmed in upholding the constitutionality of our anti-hate legislation, the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with words. These, as the court put it, are the catastrophic effects of racism. These, as the court put it, are the chilling facts of history. Tragically, Ahmadinejad's Iran, in violation of the prohibition against the direct and public incitement to genocide in both the Genocide Convention and the Treaty for an International Criminal Court, exhibits all the precursors to genocide that have led us down the road in the past. En conséquence, Monsieur le Président, et je le répète, il ne s'agit pas d'une question partisane, le gouvernement canadien devrait s'ériger en chef de file pour combattre cette culture de l'impunité et en référer aux Nations Unies et à ses agences afin que les auteurs de cette incitation au génocide promue par l'État répondent de leurs actes. On the domestic level, Mr. Speaker, the omissions are again glaring. For example, the Trône speech speaks eloquently of anniversaries we are commemorating, the 60th anniversary of Canadian citizenship, and anniversaries we are about to commemorate, such as the 400th anniversary of the founding of Quebec City. However, it makes no mention of the fact that we are commemorating now the 25th anniversary of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Indeed, there is no mention at all in the Trône speech of the Charter of Rights, though the Charter has had a transformative impact not only on our laws, but on our lives. For we have moved from being a parliamentary democracy to a constitutional democracy. The courts have moved from being arbiters of legal federalism, which they still are, to being the guarantors of rights because we, parliaments, vested in them that power. And where individuals and groups now have a panoply of rights and remedies that were unthinkable prior to the Charter, which is why the Charter has emerged as a respected and indispensable centerpiece, not only for our legal culture, but for our human relationships. Indeed, the only justice priority that the Trône speech identifies is violent crime. Now, Mr. Speaker, safe streets and safe communities are shared aspirations of all Canadians and the common objectives of all parliamentarians and parties. The point is, Mr. Speaker, that 5 of the 6 pieces of proposed legislation in the Tackling a Violent Crime Act were initiated by the government in which I served as Minister of Justice. And we were not only prepared to support that legislation in the last parliamentary session, but we were prepared to fast-track it into law. But the more important point here, Mr. Speaker, is that the justice agenda is not only about combating violent crime, whose objective we share, but it should include as a priority the protection of the vulnerable, women, children, Aboriginals, minorities, and the poor. Indeed, the test of a just society is how it treats the most vulnerable amongst us. Yet there is no mention of women's rights, thereby marginalizing as principle and policy the principle that women's rights are human rights, and there are no human rights which do not include the rights of women, while marginalizing also the needs of veterans and students. Moreover, not only is there no mention of women's rights and the ignoring of the Charter of Rights as a whole, but the government has dismantled the Court Challenges program, which was a bulwark in the promotion of both equality rights and minority rights. And while we welcome the government's commitment to the promotion and protection of official languages in Canada, it again undermines its own stated objective by the abolition of the very instrument that promoted and protected minority language rights. Nor is there any provision for an early learning and childcare program of the kind set forth in our government's federal-provincial childcare agreements, which were jettisoned by this government, thereby denying needed childcare to thousands of children while repudiating a federal-provincial agreement, thereby undermining the government's own stated commitment to open federalism. There is only perfunctory mention of poverty and the plight of the poor, but no undertaking of making poverty history on the international level or poverty reduction on the domestic level as a government priority. This notwithstanding the fact that 1 million children live in poverty, that 2.8 million families, or 1 in 5, live below the low-income cutoff, that the gap between rich and poor has reached a 3-decade high, an inequality gap usually associated with underdeveloped nations. In the matter of Aboriginal justice, while we welcome the government's apology to First Nations as part of the residential school agreement that our government had negotiated with the Assembly of First Nations and the Conservative government is duly respecting, this is far from making Aboriginal justice a priority on the justice agenda, as recommended by federal, provincial, and territorial justice ministers at the 2005 FPT conference. This includes the other framework agreements which were negotiated as well as supporting the International Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Further, Mr. Speaker, there is no reference in the throne speech as a matter of principle and policy, let alone a priority, for a comprehensive, sustainable, civil as well as criminal legal aid program, also identified unanimously as a priority on the justice agenda at the FPT conference in 2005. The lack of such a program also impacts adversely on the most vulnerable of our society, women, children, minorities, Aboriginals, the elderly, refugees, thereby further exacerbating their plight. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the government's throne speech is diminished by the absence of even reference to these priorities, while its own stated priorities are undercut and undermined by the priorities that are excluded to the detriment of all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.